So in the Bible study, or the 2 p.m. service, we started off talking about the virtuous wife or valorous wife of Proverbs 31, right? And the bride, and talked about that being a picture of the bride of Christ. In this message now, I told you earlier, I wanted to talk about Ruth and how she pictures the bride of Christ, the church, the ecclesia, the called out ones in her life. Now, we talked about Proverbs 31 being a poetic ideal, right? And all those characteristics, and there are so many there that it lists off. But Ruth is a flesh and blood woman. She's real, and so it's very interesting. She did a lot very well, but written from memory from her time or her children after, but she's a real woman, and there's a lot we can learn from her example. I do need to recap a few verses, we're looking forward to, and maybe we won't turn to Revelation 19 again, but I know that we have a lot of people who are joining now during this service that weren't with us in the other, but it talks about the marriage of the Lamb, and it says, "Blessed and holy is he who takes part in the marriage supper of the Lamb," Revelation 19, 7-9. And you can go, well, let's go ahead and turn, because Revelation 19, it says, "Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come. His wife has made herself ready. To her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints." And then he said to me, "Write, blessed are those who are called to the marriage supper of the Lamb." And he said to me, "These words are the true sayings of God." It points to the future, of course, a very special relationship between the Son, Jesus Christ, and his followers, the church, the ecclesia, the called out ones. We brought that out, and again want to emphasize that God didn't model his plan on marriage, right? He created marriage to show us the relationship he wants us to have with him. He created marriage for this purpose. And we looked at Ephesians 5, and maybe we'll just paraphrase there, but the Apostle Paul talks about in Ephesians 5 and verses 22 to 33, there's a section there where he talks about marriage, but he says over and over again, I'm talking about Jesus Christ and the church, the ecclesia, the called out ones. And in verse 33, he says, well, let me turn again. I keep worrying about time, but I know it'll work out. We've got plenty. Ephesians 5, and in verse 32, he says, again, this is a great mystery. This is a great mystery, but I speak concerning Christ and the church. And nevertheless, he said, let each one of you in particular so love his wife as himself, and let the wife see that she respects her husband. Back up in verse 31, though, he quotes from Genesis 2. He said, "For this reason a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh." So if we think back to Genesis, God created Adam in the Garden of Eden, created just Adam, right? And he created all the other animals. They had pairs, right? They had male and female, and he showed these to Adam, and Adam named all of the animals, and then he realized that something's missing. At every day of creation, remember what God said. Every time he created something, he said, the evening and the morning, and he said, God saw what he had created, and it was very good. But what did he say about man in this state, in the beginning state? He said, it is not good. That's the first thing that God created, that he said, it is not good. Not good that man should be alone. I'll create a helper suitable for him, right? And it wasn't complete without his wife. And this is all, again, this is to show us this picture of the relationship he wants to have with us. He's inviting us into his family, to be part of his family, and those called out now to be a special part of it, known as the bride of Christ. It's a great mystery, again, but Paul said, I'm speaking concerning Christ and the church. In our physical marriages, we have some really wonderful examples in our churches. I know you guys do too here, and in our families and everything. But none of us is perfect, right? We mess up, we fail at times. None of us is perfect. But when we think about Jesus Christ, he is perfect. He was perfect. He did, as Paul talked about seeing that the husband cherishes his wife and gives himself up for her. He did that, right? He did that 100%. Did it perfectly. Think about that night in the Garden of Gethsemane we commemorated, just a couple weeks ago when he was betrayed. And I'll just refer to Matthew 26:39. He said multiple times, he said, "If it is possible, let this cup pass from me, but nevertheless, not my will, but your will be done." Right? Not my will, but the will of the Father. He gave himself up completely to the will of the Father and completely for us. It was the plan from before the foundation of the world. It was the plan before there ever was a physical creation, that he would give himself up completely and fully to the will of the Father and for us. When we think about Ruth and Boaz, they're examples of this relationship that God wants to have with us. Examples of the relationship he's offering to us. I think about Ruth a lot at this time of year. It seems appropriate, and that's why I brought this message this time. It begins off and it says that Ruth and Naomi came to Israel at the time of the barley harvest, the beginning of the barley harvest. If you remember right, I think you guys probably had messages regarding, I know that Mr. Skelton, when, we got in trouble for saying Mr., but when spoke at a camp out we were at just a couple of weeks ago, and he talked about the wave sheaf offering and its symbolism to Jesus Christ. And that happens that's the beginning of the barley harvest, right? The very earliest. And it was just a couple of weeks ago during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, that morning after the Sabbath during unleavened bread. The offering of the wave sheaf offering. So this book of Ruth, the events happen all during this time period. Now, it says that they came back to Israel, or back to Bethlehem at the beginning of the barley harvest, right? And then it goes on and says that she kept working in the field. And again, we'll get to it and read some of this. But she kept working until the end of the wheat harvest. So barley is a very early crop. I've actually tried to grow it once and had fun trying, but it's not grown much around here as far as I know. But barley is an early crop. It likes the cold weather and it shoots up and matures early. So it's a good insurance crop, but it matures very early in the year. And then later on, your other grains, wheat and oats and things like that, take a little longer to mature. But I imagine during the Feast of Unleavened Bread, I think about those fields of barley and the going out to find the earliest patches of the very first ripe barley and harvesting that, representing Jesus Christ. It'd be you still have fields with a lot of green in those, but some of those stalks would be yellow and mature. Some of those stalks coming up in just a small portion. But through these days that we've gone through 2 weeks since then, and 5 more. We're day 14, right, in our count, or at least by our count there in Central Texas, and yours too, I think, here. We're at day 14 in our count to 50 to Pentecost. But this time in between is when the setting of this in between the wave sheaf offering and the count to Pentecost is when the story of Ruth takes place. Ruth is an extremely encouraging story to me as well. And one of the main reasons is because if you read the Bible in order, you've got to slog through Judges, right? And Judges is hard. It's heavy. Judges is full of people who are not doing things God's way, right? It's so, even the good ones messed up and their children messed up. You got some really hard things to understand. Why is that in there? Why did they even allow that? some of the sick and evil things that happened during the times of the judges. It ends with that civil war, the whole tribe of Benjamin nearly being wiped out. And I'm not going to go there, but when you read through in order, Judges is hard, and it gets wearisome, to be honest, going through there. That civil war and the fight and all that fight over some terrible behavior of the people of Benjamin, and that they went to war and fought to support people who were doing that, and then you get the whole tribe nearly wiped out and a little hope of restoration. But your reward for slogging through Judges and getting through it is that at the end you get to read Ruth. You get to read Ruth, and it's a breath of fresh air. It's a handful of people who lived during the time of the Judges who were following God's law. You see a few who were following God's law, including this foreign woman, the Moabite Ruth, who were following God's law and doing it right. So as I go through Ruth again, I won't, with Proverbs 31, we read the whole thing. If Ruth, I think, would take too long, we're going to go through and talk about a few passages and paraphrase the story as the best I can through here. But we'll read a few. But it's, like to think about this again, thinking about the words of Paul. That this is a great mystery, but I'm speaking about Christ and the church. I'm speaking about Christ and the church. I think that you can see the symbolism very often of Boaz being a picture of Christ in many ways, of Ruth being a picture of the church in many ways. I even think that in many ways Naomi, Ruth's mother-in-law, is a picture of the function of the Holy Spirit in many ways. Of course, every comparison has a breakdown at some point. Every comparison breaks down somewhere, but you see her giving advice and giving direction. Don't go into other fields. Go to his. Go in and let him know that you want to marry him. Let him know that you want to. And this push of her is akin to the Holy Spirit leading us through the direction of God the Father. But let me read in a couple of verses. It says, "It came to pass in the days when judges ruled." So think about that. All that chaos and all the people, doing not good things for the most part. During those days, it says, there was a famine in the land, and a certain man from Bethlehem in Judah went to dwell in the country of Moab, he and his wife and his 2 sons. The name of the man was Elimelech, and the name of his wife was Naomi. The name of his 2 sons were Mahlon and Chilion. I know I'm probably messing those names up, but they were Ephrathites from Bethlehem in Judah. They went to the country of Moab and remained there. And then you read on, and over the next 10 years, Elimelech and the 2 sons, all 3 died, leaving all 3 women, Naomi and her 2 daughters-in-law, as widows. So Naomi heard the famine was over in Israel and decided to go back home. Heard that it was over and decided to go back home to Bethlehem. It's interesting too, as we go through this study. It's a story about barley harvest and grain and wheat harvest. It's a story about a place called Bethlehem, which means house of bread in the Hebrew. And I think about in John 6 we read in the Bible study, and how Jesus Christ said, "I am the bread that came down from heaven." He is the bread of life, and his word is what gives us life. That he is, and so in this place called the house of bread, we have the story about grain and harvest. We have the story centered around that, but from it comes the family from which Jesus Christ would come into this earth, right? The family where he would come in, and the true bread from heaven given by the Father. So Naomi decides to leave, and she tells her 2 daughters-in-law. Of course, most of you are familiar with the story, but she tells them to go back to their family in Moab. Orpah says in verse 14, she kissed her mother-in-law, but Ruth clung to her. And Naomi said, look, your sister-in-law has gone back to her people and back to her gods. Return after your sister-in-law. But Ruth said in verse 16, this is important. She said, entreat me not to leave you or turn back from following after you. For wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people will be my people, and your God, my God. Where you die, I will die, and there I will be buried. The Lord do so to me, and more also, if anything but death parts you and me. And so it says, when she saw that she was determined to go with her, she stopped speaking, stopped trying to convince her. Ruth made a total commitment, a total 100% commitment to God. Said, your God will be my God. That's amazing. If you imagine someone coming from the land of Moab and all that they had done. But she said, no, your God will be my God. 100% commitment to God the Father. This is the first commandment. God said, you shall have no other gods before me, he told Israel. And Israel, the nation, very often had other gods before him. Right? They very quickly, in fact, at Mount Sinai, they created the golden calf and failed in that way. We, as the bride of Christ, should not fail, need to not fail, cannot fail. But we have to ask ourselves, is there a way we're letting other things come before God in our lives? Is there a way we're letting other things come before God? In the Central Texas Church of God, we don't have any golden calves. Don't worry if you visit. We don't have idols. We try to avoid anything that might be construed as such. But we have to always ask ourselves, what can we let creep in? What can we let creep in to our own lives that can take our time and attention that belongs to God? We can have those idols, right? It can be work, maybe, money, success, power, whatever, things that we think are important, habits and vices that can creep in and take the place of God, entertainment, and just self-indulgence, just various forms of self-indulgence can creep in and become more and more important so that we neglect God, neglect his word, neglect our prayer, neglect doing the things that he wants us to do, being his light to the world and to the people around us, people in need. I won't turn, but 1 John 2:15 through 17, it says, do not love the world or the things of the world, right? All that's of the world is passing away. In Luke 9, let me go ahead and turn there. Luke 9, Jesus Christ, in his words, he said, if anyone desires to come after me, and I'm in verse 23 of Luke 9, said, if anyone desires to come after me, let him deny himself, take up his cross daily, and follow me. And in Luke 14, this seems more harsh, but it's personal to me in a way. Luke 14, verse 26. He said, if anyone comes to me and does not hate, and we know that doesn't mean you have to hate your family, but to love less by comparison, love less your family in comparison to God. If anyone does not come to me, comes to me and does not hate his father and mother, wife and children, brothers and sisters, yes, and his own life also, he cannot be my disciple. And whoever does not bear his cross and come after me cannot be my disciple. That's, like I said, it's personal to me. I know at one point, God convicted me in a way that I was doing that. I was putting my family before him in a way. And it's hard realization to come to, but he says right there, if you love them more than me, you cannot be my disciple. And so Ruth committed 100% to God. Let me go back to Ruth. Nope. I should have moved my marker get there faster. But back to the story of Ruth, and we're going to skip to the end of chapter 1. It says in chapter 1 and verse 22, so Naomi returned, and Ruth the Moabitess, her daughter-in-law, with her, who returned from the country of Moab. They came to Bethlehem, house of bread, at the beginning of the barley harvest. Now, it's in chapter 2, it introduces Boaz. It's interesting. I'll read a few verses here. It says, there was a relative of Naomi's husband, a man of great wealth, of the family of Elimelech, whose name was Boaz. So Ruth the Moabitess said, please let me go into the field and glean heads of grain after him, in whose sight I find favor. And she said to her, go, my daughter. And she left and went and gleaned in the field of the reapers, after the reapers. And she happened to come to the part of the field belonging to Boaz, who was of the family of Elimelech. This is very interesting to me, because you have a foreign woman from Moab who is in the time of the judges, when people weren't doing things right for the most part in Israel, right? But she's appealing to God's law. She's heard or read in Leviticus 23 when we read about these holy days, or Leviticus 19 when you read about the laws that God gave, and in Deuteronomy it's given again. But let me go to Leviticus 23 verse 22. Just read about this time when you read about the wave sheaf offering we talked about, and then you read on and come to the Feast of Pentecost. And let me read in verse 22, because this is tied to those feasts. In Leviticus 23:22, it says, when you reap the harvest of your land, you shall not wholly reap the corners of your field when you reap, nor shall you gather any gleanings from your harvest. You shall leave them for the poor and the stranger. I am the Lord your God. So back to Ruth, she's appealing to that scripture. She says, and so, in this time of chaos and confusion and everything else, she's appealing to God's law. Says, I'm poor and I'm a stranger, and I need to go into the field and glean after the reapers. She's appealing to that, and I think that is part of what impressed Boaz as you read on. As he inquires about who this woman was. One thing I wanted to point out, Boaz in verse 4 says, he came from Bethlehem and said to the reapers, the Lord be with you. And they answered, the Lord bless you. And just that he was well liked by his people, by his workers. And then he inquires, and probably we should paraphrase some of that, but about who is this woman. And they explained to her, she's Ruth the Moabitess. She came with her mother-in-law from Moab, and she's come to glean after the harvesters. I think that's part of what impressed him with her, is that she was appealing to God's law, to this law, in a time when a lot of people didn't, in a time when very few people did. And Boaz understood it, knew it, and he was making provision for it, for the poor to glean in his field. She came and did that. And so he tells her in verse 8, he says, you will listen, my daughter, will you not? Do not go and glean in another field, nor go from here, but stay close by my young women and stay where they are. So she does. And then it continues their conversation in verse 10. She's humble, very humble. She fell on her face, bowed down to the ground, and said to him, why have I found favor in your eyes that you should take notice of me, since I'm a foreigner? And Boaz answered and said to her, it has been fully reported to me all that you have done for your mother-in-law since the death of your husband, how you have left your father and your mother in the land of your birth and have come to a people who you did not know. He said, the Lord repay your work and a full reward be given you by the Lord God of Israel, under whose wings you have come for refuge. Then she said, let me find favor in your sight, my Lord. You have comforted me and have spoken kindly to your maidservant, though I am not like one of your maidservants. That the humility of Ruth there is impressive. And, that the coming for refuge under the wings. I didn't put that in my notes, but it's an interesting comparison. I think about that a lot at the Feast of Tabernacles. You know, that picture of the tabernacle is a picture of a shelter, of a refuge. And we think about things like Psalm 91, taking refuge and taking shelter in God, and many other psalms. But we won't go there. But Ruth is very humble, and she was known for service. There in the section of scriptures we just read, she's served her mother-in-law selflessly. And she followed the instructions that Boaz gave her. Don't go in other fields, right? Follow my reapers. And she followed the instructions of her mother-in-law, Naomi. She followed the instructions of Naomi and of Boaz. And when she followed their instructions, she was able to harvest abundantly. When you read there, and it talks about how much grain she brought home. It was out of character, beyond reason of what you would expect to pick up after the reapers, right? He had told the people to drop full sheaves and make sure that she had plenty. That compares to many, many places. And again, this is another aside we could get into, but I won't right now. But about the concept of abundance. I would encourage you to just look up how many times God uses that word in the Old Testament and the New of abundance. When you follow God, in 2 Corinthians 8 and 9, Paul talking about giving a gift, about the church giving a gift, and that really ties in with the instructions to the church, giving a gift for those in need. But he said, how many times in those 2 chapters he uses that word abundance? He'll abundantly bless you. And he says, you've given out of your abundance, God will give back to you abundantly. And he talks about the abundance of thanksgiving and praise and everything, thanks to God. And so you read over and over again that word abundance. When we follow God, follow his instructions, he turns it back with abundance, with a multiplication that's beyond any of our math, right? It's beyond anything we can talk about or anything we can think. More than reason would say. We talked earlier about John 6 and about Deuteronomy 8, about the picture of bread. And maybe we should go to John 6 just a little bit. Again, I don't want to, it's 63 verses, or bigger than that. It's huge. But it starts off with Jesus Christ feeding the 5,000 with just a few loaves of bread and a few fish, right? And we won't read that part, but he, it expands and abundantly, with abundance. And there was more left over than they started with to begin with, by far. Jesus Christ said to them, again, the people wanted some more. They came back and wanted more, but he said, verse 32 in John 6, most assuredly I say to you, Moses did not give you this bread from heaven, but my Father gives you the true bread from heaven. For the bread of God is he who comes down from heaven and gives life to the world. What has John 3 said? Jesus said, I've come that they may have life, but have it more abundantly, right? That abundance just multiplies. This is the bread that comes down from heaven. And he said, I am the bread of life in verse 35. He who comes to me shall never hunger. He who believes in me shall never thirst. I am the bread of life. And he said in verse 63, we talked about that earlier in the Bible study, that the words I speak to you, they are spirit and they are life. So if we go back to Ruth in the story and continue on, she gathers abundantly that bread in the town called the House of Bread. But and in verse 3 is Naomi's instructions to Ruth about going and indicating to Boaz that she wanted to be his wife, that she wanted him to perform fulfill the role of the near kinsman redeemer. Again, I won't read all the details in there, but she goes in and lays on, at his feet at the threshing floor and others, and as an indication that she wanted him to fulfill that role, that he was the near kinsman redeemer, just as Jesus Christ is our near kinsman redeemer, right? She wanted him to be her husband. And in verse 10, he answers, he said, "Blessed are you of the Lord, my daughter, for you have shown more kindness at the end than at the beginning. In that you did not go after younger men, whether poor or rich." Again, I think about this and think about the words of Paul. I'm speaking about Christ and the church. That you did not go after others. And now he says, "Now, my daughter, do not fear. I know you, he says, I will do for you all that you request, for all the people of my town know that you are a virtuous woman." And guess what? We talked about that word from Proverbs 31. Virtuous woman is that hayal. Did I say that right? I didn't put it in these notes. But it is valorous, that woman of a mighty woman of valor. You know, as you would say, it's about the same adjective that he would use for David's mighty men, or an army, a powerful army. "I know that you are a virtuous woman." And he explains that, I know I am a close relative, but there is another, and we can think about parallels there, but he goes and he carries this out, right? He goes and carries it out and secures the right to marry her. Secures the right to marry her. Securing Ruth as his wife. In chapter 4, it goes through the legal process and he makes it official. In 4 verse 9, let me read a few verses. It says, "Boaz said to the elders and all the people, you are witnesses this day that I have brought all that was Elimelech's and all that was Chilion's and Mahlon's from the hand of Naomi. And moreover," verse 10, "Ruth the Moabitess, the widow of Mahlon, I have acquired as my wife to perpetuate the name of the dead through his inheritance, that the name of the dead may not be cut off from among his brethren and from his position in the gate. You are witnesses this day." And all the people who were at the gate and the elders said, "We are witnesses. The Lord make this woman who is coming into your house like Rachel and Leah, the two who built up the house of Israel. And may you prosper in Ephratah and be famous in Bethlehem." Again, the house of bread. "May your house be like the house of Perez, who Tamar bore to Judah, because of the offspring which the Lord will give you from this young woman." So Boaz took Ruth, and she became his wife. And when he went into her, the Lord gave her conception, and she bore a son. Then the women said to Naomi, "Blessed be the Lord, who has not left you this day without a close relative, and may his name be famous in Israel. And may he be to you a restorer of life and a nourisher of your old age, for your daughter-in-law, who loves you, who is better to you than 7 sons, has borne him." It says, "Then Naomi took the child, laid him on her bosom, and became a nurse to him. And the neighbor women gave him a name, saying, 'There is a son born to Naomi.' They called his name Obed. He is the father of Jesse, the father of David." And then it goes through the genealogy there down to King David. But we know that that's not the end of it, right? In this little town called the House of Bread, and this little family that was following God's law when nobody else was, or seems like nobody else was. There were some, I know. The very bread of life came later. The very bread of life came. A small group following God's law. Very much like the church now. A small group who's willing to follow God's law and willing to do what he says, no matter what. But they, Ruth and Boaz, of course, we've left tons you can go into and study, but they're an example for us. They're an example for us of following God's law, trusting in him, doing what he says, trusting in him alone. and from them the bread of life arises, and the family will grow and grow and grow, the increase like we talked about with Proverbs 31. So thank you guys for joining with us today. It's been a pleasure, and pleasure talking with all of you, and have a great rest of your Sabbath. Thanks.